Hello everybody, we're delighted to welcome you today to our first online International Women's Day event. My name is Vikki Goddard and I am the Director of Operations for our Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health here at Manchester, and I'm also our Professional Services Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Champion. So I'm delighted to be able to welcome you and introduce everybody to today's webinar. As you'll know, this year's International Women's Day theme is Choose to Challenge, and it's collectively how we can all help create a more inclusive world by choosing to challenge and call out gender bias and inequity and seek out and celebrate women's achievements. And I think our webinar, our keynote today, will really focus on those issues and enable us to really think about how we all choose to challenge on this day and on all days, which is just so important for us all to develop further gender equality, both in the UK and more broadly across the world. In a minute, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker, Nicole Brown, but just to let you know, you'll be able to ask questions and we'll have a Q&A session after Nicole has been through her presentation. If you want to ask a question, you can post it in the comments on Facebook throughout the events and we'll pick them up in our session later. We do have some questions that have been posted before the event, so thank you very much for those and we'll pick those questions up in the Q&A session as well. I'm delighted to introduce this morning Nicole Brown, who is Director of Social Research and Practice in Education Limited and a lecturer in education at the UCL Institute of Education, London. Nicole's just put a video on to wave and say hello to everybody. Nicole's research focuses on the experience of disabled, chronically ill and or neurodivergent members of HE staff. She gained a PhD in sociology at the University of Kent for her research into the construction of academic identity under the influence of fibromyalgia. She's edited Lived Experiences of Ableism in Academia, Strategies for Inclusion in HE, and Ableism in Academia, Theorising Experiences of Disabilities and Chronic Illnesses in Higher Education. Her research interests relate to physical and material representations and metaphors, the generation of knowledge, and more generally research methods and approaches to explore identity and bodywork, as well as to advance learning and teaching within higher education. And for those of you who are on Twitter, she tweets at Ableism Academia. I'm delighted to welcome Nicole on this International Women's Day, where we choose to challenge to deliver her keynote, It's All in Your Head, the experience of disabled women in higher education, where she'll draw on her own experiences and her own research. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nicole. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Vikki. Thank you very much for this very kind invitation to today's event. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you very much to anyone who's watching and who's interested in this. I'm going to present from slides, but I do not expect you to read every single slide. There are some slides that will be literally just for information, and they will be made available later on as well. So today's talk really is obviously about the experience of disabled women in higher education. And I would just like to very briefly outline how I've come to talk about this, or why I have been invited today to talk about this. Has already been said, there are several research projects that I have been involved in and have led on that relate to all sorts of experiences of chronic illnesses, disabilities and neurodivergence in higher education. And there are many outcomes from that, as you can see, books, articles, book chapters. The things that I'm going to focus on today specifically are about relating to managing the ill body in higher education and the social cause of fibromyalgia. So I will be focusing on fibromyalgia, but I will actually relate that to the experiences of chronic illnesses and disability more widely. So to start off, fibromyalgia is a very, very complex condition. It's one of those conditions that are in your head. It doesn't show up as any kind of blood result. It doesn't show anywhere in any kind of physiological test. So it really is something that you are slapped with in terms of a label when there is nothing else left for you. Fibromyalgia is characterized by widespread chronic pain. And these images here to the left and in the middle are highlighting that experience as to what it would look like if we were able to see the widespread pain. Fibromyalgia is also characterized by sleep disturbances, psychological dysfunctions, cognitive dysfunctions, and this is on the right to this in the slide. People describe the cognitive dysfunction as brain fog. And all of those things together make it a very, very contested and complex condition, but very contested even within the medical realms. And that's one of the problems that we are dealing with. This is International Women's Day, and fibromyalgia is a very good example, therefore, to bring it in on today's day, because it is considered as a women's disease. The ratio between men and women getting fibromyalgia is somewhere between 9 to 1. There are several reasons as to why women are more likely to be diagnosed with fibromyalgia, but one of them is actually the fact that fibromyalgia is somehow related to hormonal issues. We don't really understand exactly how, but they are there, and that's why fibromyalgia is quite an interesting condition in that sense. What made it interesting for me was we do have this idea of the brain fog that's part of the experience of fibromyalgia, which basically means that you have word retrieval problems, you suddenly have memory issues, you have sequencing problems. So, for example, you would be brushing your teeth and then put the toothpaste on the toothbrush afterwards, or you're washing your hands and then you go to toilet. So it's all this kind of sequencing issues. And for me, it was particularly interesting to kind of look at how academics make sense of their academic identity when they have got a condition or they're diagnosed with a condition. That means that their brain may not be fully engaged and functional at all times. This is by no means trying to denigrate the experience. This is by no means trying to say that people are not as capable as people without fibromyalgia, but this is kind of the personal experience that we are talking about within fibromyalgia. So I started out with a study. I'm not going into great details, but just pointing out some key issues here. And it was with 28 participants. And as you can see, the ratio between men and women, again, is quite typical, because actually there just are not that many men that are diagnosed with the condition. So I used identity boxes and interviews, and I used iterative inductive semantic thematic analysis. But basically, it was a case of identifying that the sense making of fibromyalgia and the experience of fibromyalgia is happening on a scholarly and on an emotional level. And this is really what I'm talking about today, as to how fibromyalgia is kind of, you know, an example of the disability experience in higher education. A lot of people during the study were talking specifically about managing fibromyalgia symptoms. So there is a lot there about support and gadgets, obviously using medication, creams, support pillows, massages, homeopathy. And it's basically one of those things that is really, really difficult, because there is nothing that proves that you have got fibromyalgia. So therefore, by deduction, we would say, well, it's just in your head. Therefore, trying to kind of alleviate some of those symptoms with things like massages and homeopathy is actually quite in line with that idea, saying that actually, you know what, there is nothing physically wrong with you. There is nothing physiologically wrong with you. So here we go. Here are the complementary alternative ways of dealing with your pain. Again, this is not about trying to denigrate or deny the advantages of massages or homeopathy, but it just kind of feeds into that narrative of a woman being a little bit weak, a bit vulnerable, you know, like imagining a lot of their pain and a lot of the symptoms, and this is how we then treat them. there is, unfortunately, within the medical discourses, quite a lot of sort of concern about fibromyalgia not being real and really just being a condition that's related to the psychological and the psychosomatic. So it kind of sits between the physiological and the psychosomatic, and that makes it even more difficult to deal with from a medical point of view, because from a medical standpoint, who is in charge of fibromyalgia? If I'm saying to you that it's a pain condition, well, that would send it straight to the pain managers. But actually, it's not just that. There is more to it, so it has to go somewhere else. And therefore, what you then have is that some people will be put to rheumatology, but actually rheumatology deals with things that show up in blood. Fibromyalgia doesn't. So where do we go? We then go to the psychologist and the psychiatrist. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying that this is for the right reasons, but unfortunately, anyone who's getting sent to psychologist or psychiatrist may take it as a sign that actually the illness is not taken seriously. It's not taken as a serious issue, as a serious condition. It's just in your head. Hence, the start of the presentation being called "It's Only in Your Head." There are some strategies that people are talking about, specifically about pretending. So they're basically pretending to be well. They feel the pain, they feel the difficulties, the fatigue and all of those things, but at the same time they pretend that everything's fine. So they're trying to take notes more, for example. They're trying to alternate tasks. So there are different strategies people start engaging in order to manage the fibromyalgia symptoms. What really happens here is it's a manipulation of the body and the manipulation and the management of self. This brings me to the kind of image of managing the public and the private self. Now, we will be talking a little bit more later on about all sorts of different issues around, coming to terms with conditions. But in general terms, we know that in academia that the self is really equated with the academic self, and we are also that is also equated with the idea that academic self cannot be weak. So publicly we need to be strong, we need to be excellent, we need to be productive, effective, all of those things. And trying to then bring in the experience of fibromyalgia or any kind of chronic condition would suggest that therefore you're weak, you're not as good, and that's something that you, as an academic, people find different to manage and different to navigate. The other thing that's often happening is there is a certain experience of isolation during and after illness bouts. So if anyone has ever been at home for a flu, just a very simple flu-like infection, it's something that when you come back, you feel like you have missed out on a lot of conversations and emails. Well, that's obviously compounded if it's a chronic condition and you don't actually ever cut up properly because you're constantly in that area where you have to deal with your body and you have to manage the symptoms. Now, in higher education, there is this issue with negotiating illness because academia is generally seen as an area of privilege, autonomy and freedom. And actually what we're seeing is that it's not quite in reality, that's not quite the case. Academia does become quite romanticized in that way. It's seen as a lifestyle choice. You know, once you're an academic, you devote yourself to that kind of lifestyle. But actually, it's like I'm saying, it's kind of a romanticized version of it. As a workplace, we all know that higher education is, full of all sorts of excellence and impact discourses. We know that there is this, requirement to be productive and effective. And at the same time, all those league tables that we have are also working towards that, where we're saying, for example, prestige. The prestige of the university I'm working for is something that I have to work towards as well. I can't benefit from the prestige of my university without contributing to it. So again, the prestige discourses lead to further step towards overwork and workaholism. So again, there is no room for weakness. So where does that leave those people that have a condition, a disability, a neurodivergence. I mean, obviously in my research with the fibromyalgia, people with fibromyalgia, there is a certain way of how people work against and resist the kind of discourses of being weak. What they do is they actively reject their diagnosis, and they actively and proactively take countermeasures to assuming the sick role. So they are not giving up on their work. They're more likely to give up on social networks and family, and to actually continue with their ordinary activities, pretending that they're not ill. The issue that I have identified with all of these kind of conversations I've had is that academics are not really willing to consider alternative careers or non-employment. That sets them apart from people who also have fibromyalgia but do not work in academia. There is something specific about academics that we find ourselves in a position where we are not willing. So because our academic identity is so tightly linked with our personal identity, we can't give up on that academic identity. Therefore, we can't give up on our work. People who are outside of academia seem to find that easier because their identity, personal identity, is not as strongly linked to the work employment identity that they assume under normal circumstances. What I would like to say with this is that obviously all of those things that I've highlighted paint a rather negative and sort of hopeless picture, but I'm actually not a pessimist. I'm actually quite a hopeful person. So the question is there any hope with that? I would say yes, absolutely. What we have found is that through this whole experience of working with ableism in academia over the last few years, there have been some changes already happening. We can see that mental health and well-being are becoming more important. Yes, in many cases, it feels like a tokenistic activity still, and I agree with you. But at the same time, it's the tokens that count as a step towards the real initiative later on. Through the pandemic that we have now nearly gone through for an entire year, there are certain things that have changed as well. We can see that ways of working are now different. People are more likely to be accepted as flexible workers or home office workers. There are approaches towards software and assistive technologies which are more broadly available that weren't there before. So all of those things have actually added and helped to kind of create a slightly different picture to what it feels like to be a woman and disabled or chronically ill in academia. I think that with a heightened sense of community and empathy, that to me is kind of the crux of all of our work. It is actually possible to kind of steer the changes away and actually create more changes, longer term changes within higher education. In the next two slides, I'm just going to point out to you two books that may be of interest to you. This is Ableism in Academia, Theorizing Experiences, and the link is there for the free download. And this is the book, Lived Experiences of Ableism in Academia, Strategies for Inclusion in Higher Education. There is a lot more information there, but I would like to make sure that we've got plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm just going to stop right here with one last thing to say. It's all in your head, the experience of disabled women in higher education. We know women are being disadvantaged in many ways. We know disabled women or disabled people in general are disadvantaged in many, many ways. And obviously the disabled woman takes the whole experience to quite a different level. But that doesn't mean that we don't try to chip away at the existing status quo. It means that we have to work together to actually bring about significant changes for the long term. Thank you very much.
Nicole, thank you so much for that presentation. That was excellent, and I'm sure, well, I know there's already a lot of questions that have come in, that have been submitted to you. I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that this year has thrown up lots of opportunities for working differently and sort of the realization about how people can work. But it's also had so many different challenges, hasn't it, for people, and the disproportionate effect that the pandemic's had on disabled people who've been shielding for the year, for working parents, with small children who've been having to homeschool as well as doing their whole job. So, what do you think universities should be doing and research funders should be doing to sort of support our research and our academic staff?
So in my view, the importance is to talk to the people that are having those experiences and then listen to them. And I think that's kind of how it started to happen over the last few years. But obviously there is still a lot more that needs to be done. So for example, research funders are still tying their research monies towards particular kinds of things that you can pay with that research money. And often what it says is that for example, you can't pay for hotel accommodation. Now that, I understand why they do that, because obviously you don't want researchers go off on a journey and book a holiday on the cost of a research fund. So I understand that problem. But at the same time, by saying we are definitely not paying for any kind of accommodation, there are just too many people who are not able to therefore actually conduct their research. Because for disabled people, for women with children, that hotel room is needed for the break, for being able to put the children somewhere whilst they're actually doing the research. So having that, taking that option away is something that's actually quite discriminating, but it's not necessarily intentional. It's not necessarily that people are doing that on purpose to discriminate in that way. It's just that they don't understand the need for that hotel accommodation. And this is why I'm saying, actually talking to those people, if somebody says to you, well, I want you to fund my hotel stay, then don't just say no, ask them why, and they will give you a good reason. Well, then you can't really say no anymore.
I mean, one thing we've tried to do in the faculty is having a carer support fund to sort of help people be able to go and take carers or get additional help and needed for when people go to conferences. So, that's sort of one thing we're trying to do there, but I feel like you need more, we need big things to happen at the research funder level as well, don't we?
Yes, and I think I agree with what you're saying. There is only so far that an individual institution can go. It's the entire sort of society, really. It's not just even the higher education sector. It's the entire society that needs to change their thinking. I mean, only just 2 days ago there was a report published about the gender pay gap when it comes to pensions. Anybody who's 20 years of age now and retires in whatever 46 years, 47 years, they will find women will find themselves £100,000 less off than men, and that is something that's obviously a societal thing. So trying to kind of change these things feels like a humongous, massive task, and that's really difficult. But at the same time, what I'm trying to say is I'm always trying to say to people, let's just try and do what we can. And if there's enough of us doing what we can, we will actually make the bigger change too.
So, as you say, academia, higher education, research, they're all areas which, have huge high workload. They've got the need for impact and outputs, and workloads are high, and fixed term contracts for researchers and PS staff and academics. So it's this huge load on it. So people are worried about sort of negative consequences, aren't they, of disclosing health conditions. And what do you think that we can do to sort of better support people in opening up and getting support?
So again, I mean, this is quite a particular area of my research where I've specifically looked at what it feels like to disclose in academia. And this comes out of my fibromyalgia study as well. But basically what I've found in my work is that there is a cost-benefit analysis. And if I can just share a screen that may be of help here to kind of exemplify what I'm talking about. So basically, there is this cost-benefit analysis of whether you are disclosing or not. And if we're looking at the cost and what the benefits are, the costs really are things around like stigma. You know, there's a public cost of disclosure, but there's also a private cost, because you have to, first of all, be able to say, I'm ill, I need help. So it's a very personal decision as well. It's not just the public stigma that we're working against. We're working against our own internalized ableism in that sense. And then obviously there are the other things that, you know, like you said, people being treated differently. That's something that you're worried about. You're worried about repercussions, your everyday role, academic progression. You end up actually having to manage other people's responses to your own illness. So there's a lot of things that are the cost in academia. Well, what are the benefits though? If we're saying that disclosure is a cost-benefit analysis, at the moment it looks like the costs are quite top-heavy. The benefits really are just adjustments. That's the only thing we've got. But even if we're looking at the adjustments in greater detail, actually adjustment means that you're being treated differently again. It requires extra effort and time to ask and organize those adjustments. There are things that where you're having to ask about, you know, will there be repercussions? So that kind of lack of transparency, that still remains. So if you're looking at that, at the bottom line, if the benefits are literally just some adjustments, but actually even within that, I've got some more costs involved, then I'm not going to ever disclose my condition. So what universities can do is literally to basically bring up the network of support for individuals. For example, make available things like particular kinds of software, ways of working, allowing people to take time off when they need to without actually worrying about the repercussions of it. So it's that kind of thing. I mean, within the student body, we have extenuating circumstances. We've got extensions. There's all those things. Students are given laptops to help them with their work if they've got dyslexia, for example. So all of those different things, for the students, it pays to disclose. For the staff member, it doesn't really. And that's the problem here.
Yeah, I think we do very well, don't we, at talking to the students about what support needs they have, and you know, got that in place. But you know, what we need to be doing better is you know, our staff, and being allies and generating networks and support. Yes. And empathy and compassion and all of these really important things for the organisation that's going to improve everybody's working life. So another thing that I just wanted to ask you a bit more about sort of disclosure is the language that we use. You know, so I read your chapter in your book about disclosure, and you sort of talk about the language and the different terminologies that are used. You know, words like disclosure and declaration always seem sort of very big, and perhaps make it harder for people to sort of come forward and talk to their line managers about their support needs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I totally agree with what you're saying. Is the language is incredibly important, but at the same time, the language is something that's not universally applicable. So it's not what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. So, and that's something, you know, like, for example, I'm not comfortable with the word declare or declaration, whereas I'm okay with disclose and disclosure. And that's a personal choice in a way. Some words just feel more loaded than others, but at the same time, I mean, it goes further, doesn't it? Because we're talking about person with disability or the disabled person. So where do we put that? At the same time, people with chronic conditions, chronic illnesses, and neurodivergences may not necessarily identify at a personal level, may not necessarily identify as disabled because they don't see themselves as disabled. In terms of the law, legally, yes, they count as disabled, but having to be able to say, actually, I am disabled, that requires quite a lot of work at a personal level initially. So I think in terms of, you know, what kind of universities you do with that, I think the only thing that a university can do is basically just to say, actually, however you identify, whether you identify as the deaf person with a capital D or a person with hearing impairments, we will accept you and we will welcome you and we will support you. So to kind of not ask specific ways of identification, I think that's the important message here.
I'm just going to ask one of the questions that sort of came in the pre-submission form, which was somebody asking what should be done to enable senior leaders to become allies of disabled staff and advocates for disability equality.
So that is a really, really important question. And I think as senior leaders, anyone in a leadership position, they should find a way, and I'm not saying that it's easy, but they should find a way to not put the disabled person into an even more difficult position. So for example, if you're known as the person with whatever disability, when it comes to any kind of hiring panel, you're bound to sit on it because they need a disabled person on there for EDI issues. So it's again, you know, I'm in many ways, I'm the token disabled and woman. So I tick 2 boxes with one go. It's a nice one. If you get a person from specific ethnic backgrounds, you may even get a black disabled woman in, so you can tick 3 EDI ticks straight away. And that puts those people in extra positions that are particularly difficult to manage, because, you know, this is extra work, this is extra, not just, you know, physical work, but also emotional labor. There is a lot extra that's required. There is an extra burden placed on those individuals. So I think the senior leaders must make sure that a person who is publicly stating, I have got whatever condition, disability, neurodivergence, whatever ethnicity, whatever faith, not to use that against those people in a way by saying, oh, I need you on all my panels, for example. And I think that's it's more to do with just being aware, recognizing that there are different ways of working, not putting people on spot, and actually supporting them in that way in the background. And I think that's probably more important, because quite frankly, if you know that you're ending up on all sorts of EDI panels, hiring panels, whatever it is, committees, all of those different committees that we've got, how likely is it that you're going to disclose your condition? Because you can see where it ends up.
Natalie, can I just come in on this?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, firstly, just say thank you to Nicole, because I think it's been really interesting listening to kind of the, you know, the key issues coming out of her talk. And I think I'm going to go back to what you said kind of with the first question, Nicole, that, you know, it's about listening and asking people. So I think one of the key things you can do as a senior leader actually is to talk to people and understand where they're coming from. And it's just, some of it is as simple as that. And then you have to act on it. So absolutely right. You know, it's this whole thing about, you know, getting the gay person, the black person, whatever, onto the panel is just so, you know, and it kind of reflects this deficit model that we have quite a lot of the time, that focuses on the difference and not on the strengths that somebody brings to something. So I think there's something really powerful for senior leaders in developing that allyship, to be talking to people and getting under the skin and understanding what's going on and understanding the strengths that different people from a broad diversity are bringing, and working with that. And I think sometimes, and I've seen this quite a bit in my own role as a kind of, you know, diversity champion at the university, people are scared. They're scared of having the conversations because they're worried that they'll say the wrong thing, or they'll ask something that's seen as inappropriate, rather than just actually saying, do you know what, I don't understand this, I need to understand a bit more. And the way I'll understand a bit more is by, you know, partly by reading up on it, of course, and partly by talking to people that have these experiences and working through that. And then that enables you to start to have a different kind of conversation. But it has to be genuine in working some of that through. And I think that then enables us to start to have those more open and helpful and constructive conversations, rather than it being seen as the difference all the time.
I agree with you. And actually, when people, senior leaders, are doing that, they also are role models for how we should act, and that will filter down to anyone and everyone. So it's also about being good role models. So, I mean, for example, one of the most prominent examples for me is always when you go to a conference under normal circumstances, the speaker goes up to the lectern and then says, "Oh, you don't need me to use the microphone, do you?" I mean, how likely is it that the person who does need that microphone feels able to put their hand up to say, actually, I do need you to use it? So being the good role model by just walking there and automatically sticking that microphone onto your clothes and using it without any kind of comment about it, that's the kind of thing that you can be done. And there are many small things like that that everyone can do, not just senior leaders, but everyone, just being a good role model in that sense.
I have a question for Vikki in terms of, what measures are we taking in the faculty to understand the experiences of underrepresented groups within the faculty? Obviously, I'm Athena Swan, lead from the School of Medical Sciences, and sit on the faculty EDI panel. And, obviously we sort of deal with lots of intersectionality there. But, from a broad faculty and across the university level, Vikki,
So it's interesting. I mean, I think there's I've been at the university for 4 years, and I think there's been quite a change actually over that period of time in how we're engaging and really starting to understand this. And I think we have done, it's much higher up the agenda, diversity as an issue, which I think is a good thing, probably later than it should have been, but there we go, better late than never. And it's been interesting because I think we've done some really brilliant, work on Athena, and you can see some real impact in terms of gender. And I think we've picked up some of the other issues through that intersectionality, Natalie, that you talked about. But it feels to me like kind of everything else is kind of sat behind the gender, the work a bit. And I think we're now starting to see a much clearer view emerge around the criticality of diversity, and that we need to be looking at this and celebrating and recognising the strengths of a more diverse kind of staff base and of our students. And there's a long way to go, clearly, but I think we are starting to work much more clearly in a more strategic way to say we need to be celebrating diversity and encouraging and supporting it, and really getting under the skin of the root causes of, for example, why we're not making as much progress, anything like as much progress as we would want to see in terms of staff with disabilities, in terms of particularly Black members of staff and other minority ethnic groups. I think we're really starting to try and get under the skin to understand what's happening there in terms of our staff. And I think the moves that we've made organisationally now to create a new Equality and Diversity Directorate, which will have much more prominence across the university to really drive forward what we need to do. We're doing a lot of work through our student experience programme to look at diversity of the student body and to make sure that that's linked into that broader Equality and Diversity Directorate, and particularly our widening participation. We did a lot of work on access, and again, that's a massive intersectional issue. We've done a lot of work on access, but then we bring students in that we recognise can, gain the best from the sort of education that we provide. And then are we ensuring that we're supporting those students to succeed? So again, we've got to pull those areas together, and a lot of that is around the diversity issues that we have in general. So there's a long way to go. I think we're starting to be much better at reflecting that through. We're putting an EDI strategy together at university level so that we'll move from kind of quite a project-based approach into something that's much more embedded. And I think that's the critical thing we need to do, that we embed our moves towards improving diversity across the university and embed it in what we do rather than having special projects and add-ons, because that will get you so far, but it won't get you to the point that we really need to, where we can start to have these very much more kind of open and sensible conversations about what it is that we're doing, and how diversity is actually something that absolutely should be part and parcel of what we are and improves the university that we are.
What about your experience with other universities, Nicole?
I think, you know, what you just said, Vikki, is something that I have observed across other universities as well, and actually in the sector too. So Advanced HE, for example, have created a document about EDI issues. The Royal Society has commissioned a report on disabilities amongst scientists. There are sort of all these different kind of groups that are starting to look at the experience of disabilities or diversity in broader senses, but it is there. But obviously, it's like you said, Vikki, it's a slow change. And I think that's the frustration that we all have, is that we can see change, but at the same time, it's just so slow. And that's difficult to deal with. I think the big change that has happened is that we now realize our students need role models. They need to be able to see themselves. And if you're ending up in an all-white university with no women or black women or disabled black women at the helm, then how are you as a black disabled woman, whatever it is, other kind of, you know, like faith-based characteristic you have, how can you see yourself belonging there? Well, you can't. So, and I think that's the big shift across the sector, that there is this recognition we do need role models to look up to.
What do we do to encourage people to disclose their disability, be visible role models?
I think at the end of the day, I think there is obviously being a good role model, you know, yourself is helpful. So I do walk the walk. I don't just talk the talk, for example. So all of the things I do say, but at the same time I think it's important to give people leeway and the license to not be perfect. And I think that's also another thing that's really important. So for example, when we're talking about making things accessible for, you know, and therefore helping people to disclose, because we know that there'll be a support system available, actually to be honest about it and say, look, I cannot physically meet everybody's needs at all of the time. That is physically impossible. And I can give you a very good example. So on the roads in the UK, on the pavements, where the pavement then hits the road, and as you're going towards those kind of, you know, like crossings, there are these little knots at the bottom. So anyone who's got sort of some visual impairment can feel on the floor that they are hitting the road, and they have to be careful. Well, that's brilliant for those people, but anyone in a wheelchair will tell you how painful they are. So you can't have the knobs and not have the knobs at the same time. Equally, as we are now working in an online space, there are people who find many videos and many tiles incredibly distracting, and to the point where cognitive dysfunction starts setting in because of sensory processing disorders, etc. So they would want, ideally, everybody to have their cameras off, and even the speaker to have their camera off. So it's literally just a black screen, nothing else. On the other hand, you've got those people who need the body language to be able to read, who need to lip read from the speaker. So those people need the cameras on, and everybody's camera, because whoever is then pitching in and speaking, they need to see that person too. Again, same thing. You can't have the camera on and off at the same time. It just doesn't work. So trying to accept that we do have to compromise, and therefore giving people the license to say, look, I don't expect you to be 100% perfect 100% of the time, but I do expect you to do the best you can. I think that will go a long way.
I think it's also flexing, isn't it? Because I think, you know, looking at this from a manager's perspective, and I've heard this quite a lot from people, and we're having it as a very live debate just around kind of return to work, physical return to work, and hybrid working and what that means. there's a lot of discussion about fairness and equity, and people's definitions of that or how they think about it are different. So some people think that fairness means treating everybody exactly the same, and some people think that fairness means treating people in a way that is fair and reasonable for them in the context of the whole. And I think helping people and supporting them to work with the teams that they work with to enable those things to happen helps with the compromise and helps to build the confidence with people that says, actually, I can have this conversation that says, I'm kind of struggling with this, whether it's a protected characteristic or whether it's just something about the way that they work and their preferences. I think there's something really important about creating the environment in which people feel confident they can have those conversations and that it's taken on board and listened to. And you may not be able to sort everything out. You know, I have conversations with my team all the time where they kind of say, I know you can't do anything about this, and sometimes I can and sometimes I can't, but you know, but I'm just telling you because that helps. And you know, I think it is about that kind of, you know, we talk about kind of compassion and kindness and things, but some of it is just enabling those conversations to happen, to try and make it even a little bit better than it is at the moment, and do things in a way that is kind of feels a bit more equitable and supportive. It's about people want to feel supported, don't they? And enabled to do the best they can.
Yeah, absolutely. Back to listening and asking and doing what we can for people. Yeah. Now, I did have one question that had been pre-submitted, Vikki, that's perhaps less positive, and it's somebody's experience of the university's treatment of a chronically ill academic being a negative one. And the person posed the question, in what way are we applying Dr. Brown's research to improve the experience of current staff? Yeah, so I mean, I'm sorry that somebody had that, you know, negative kind of feeling, negative experience around that. It is challenging, isn't it? Because, you know, as we've been talking, a lot of this is down to people and how they work together and their experience. And, you know, I think what we're trying to do is create that environment in which you could have that conversation in a more helpful and enabling and supportive way. But I think we've got quite a lot of work to do, I think, still to enable people feeling that they're working within that environment and actually giving people the confidence to be able to have that conversation with other colleagues and sort of say, okay, let's find a way through, because we all know there are a variety of voices in every environment that we work in, some of whom are kind of putting quite a lot of pressure on, that are, you know, as Nicole was talking about, sort of saying things about, well, you know, that person isn't pulling their weight or you know, doing the job that we need them to do, and that's not fair. And I think we've got to create an environment which enables that conversation to happen in a way that starts to say, well, we're trying to work this through, but you know, this colleague has some challenges and issues here, so we're trying to support them as well as make sure we don't end up putting too much of that work, or perceived to be, onto somebody else. So I think for me, it's about how we work together and how we support each other to be able to deal with those things in a way that is more supportive of everybody's experience, and enables us to work through that. I think, you know, we can all give examples of places where that's worked very well and others where it has been more difficult, obviously, in this particular. We do also have kind of more systematic interventions through different schemes where people can go and talk to other people. Obviously, we have counselling, we have online support services, and ways in which we can ensure that colleagues are getting that support if they don't feel that they're getting it from their managers. So again, it's about making sure that we've got visibility of those different support mechanisms for people to enable things to be addressed and not become really challenging for individuals. Thanks, Vikki. Nicole, another question that has sort of come in is about how to positively challenge hidden discrimination within the workplace, often the behaviours that are being expressed by colleagues or managers.
That's a really difficult one. How do you go back to somebody to say, well, to be honest, I personally don't. And that probably tells you a lot already. So I try to do things differently. I do know that there are, you know, in order to provide change and to develop change at an institution or a department or a faculty, wherever you find yourself in, you do need a bottom-up approach where you yourself are the role model and you're doing certain things and you're showing and you're talking and you're explaining. But then you do also need a top-down approach where certain policies are being put into place, and the people need to be there to be held accountable against those policies as well. So it's not just, you know, it's not just a one-person thing here. You do need the work of many different cogs in the wheel to actually get this rolling properly. Now, in my own institution, there are ways of reporting certain kinds of harassment or you know, any kind of discrimination, whatever it is, anonymously through the institutional reporting system. And I think that's a good way of doing that. At a personal level, if I was found, you know, that I'd be treated wrongly in my view or differently, I do try to sort of say something, but I wouldn't say it as in this is about me and my experience. I would actually play it out as this is a general experience. And in our department, this is what we feel. It's not just about me, but about several people, because it goes back to that idea of obviously of worrying about repercussions, isn't it? And you don't want to be seen to egg on particular kinds of people in your own working environment. So yes, absolutely. But at the same time, so whilst I wouldn't approach a single person in that kind of situation, I also don't leave it untold or untreated. I just go at it from a slightly different angle. I hope that this is helpful in some way, but I do think that you know, I'm also in some way not quite as established in my contract as I would like to. So I also have to be careful about what I do and how I'm seen. And you know, there is always the danger of being seen as a difficult person, and you don't necessarily want that. So yes, absolutely, be careful, but it doesn't mean that you can't deal with it in other ways.
Yeah, we certainly have a report and support network here in Manchester as well, that people can report any sort of discriminatory behaviour or harassment, or witness it or experience it. So
I think it's also, I mean, you're right, you know, and again, that as Nicole's saying, you know, there are issues here about some of the power relationships, which you know, can cause more of a challenge, you know, but I do think, and you know, it goes back to the choose to challenge thing, isn't it? You know, I always say kind of to colleagues, and I try and do it myself, you know, you can't always do it, but you know, there is something about challenging and being brave. And it is hard, even for senior leaders, sometimes, you know, to do that. But I do believe there is something about helping to challenge in the right way, particularly where you see poor behaviour. And it's interesting because I certainly don't do it every time I see it, but I have done it on occasion. And it's very interesting that actually sometimes it only takes one person to say something, and you will get an awful lot of support, and people will start to say, actually, absolutely right, this is not acceptable, this is not the way we want to be doing things. And it helps to start a different sort of conversation, which again is absolutely what we need to be doing.
I think the other thing that to also consider at this stage is that actually some of the behaviours or some of the things that are being said may not necessarily be intentional.
Yeah.
It just may come out of lack of awareness as well, because if you yourself have never had cancer, how can you empathize with somebody who does? So it's that kind of experience as well that we have to, you know, you don't want to go out and challenge someone straight away when actually it may not have been intentional in the first place.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole. We're reaching sort of towards the end of our session now, so I'm just wondering if there's anything that you'd like to raise that haven't come up. I know there might be a few questions that we haven't been able to touch on now, and what we'll do is we'll sort of get an answer to those after and post them, and in the post meeting feedback, okay, to people. So any questions that we haven't been able to address in this session, we'll make sure get answered for people who posed them. Is there anything else that you'd like to raise?
I think, yes, please. I think the thing about disabilities and you know, like difficulties in the workplace in that sense, whether that's for disabilities or race, faith, gender, whatever it is, at the end of the day, we just have to be patient, chip away at the things that we can chip away, and be patient for change to happen. It will happen. Yes, it's incredibly painful and frustrating that it hasn't happened yet, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we give up. And I think that's the danger, is that a lot of people are then saying, well, I can't see any change, so I'm just going to give up on this. And that's the wrong way to go. It actually just means that we have to work harder at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the other thing I would add to that is that it's really important that you have that you can find that support that you need. I think one of the things that I found more empowering and helpful than anything else, and it's a work thing, but it's also a home thing. So, you know, I think one of the big challenges we've had around COVID is the differential impact that it's had on women and men in terms of particularly caring responsibilities and working from home and those sorts of things. And I think having that support network of people around you who can kind of recognise and help you through it, and recognise what's kind of a systemic thing and what you can play your own part in to try and help move things along a bit, you know, I think is really, really important to enable things to move on and help you do that constant chipping away and not feeling like you're not making any progress at all. So I think working with people and helping people support, you know, helping other people and having other people support you through is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we'd better start drawing this to an end. So really, once again, Nicole, huge thank you. And I'm sorry we're not all in a lecture theatre, which would have a huge round of applause, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.
I would really like to recommend that people go out and look at your book, because, you know, there's so much interesting, important information there. It's very accessible. It's very good to read. So, you know, I think everyone should sort of go out and download your book and read it and learn more and listen more and ask more. And we can all, you know, sort of work together as a community to improve day-to-day experience for all of our staff and our students. So I've got a slide here which just has links to some of the networks that we've got at the university, and there'll be links to this on the Facebook page and after the event as well. And, you know, as we've spoken about a lot during this meeting, sort of actually being able to talk to people and a sense of community and empathy is really, really important. The theme for this year's IWD is, of course, Choose to Challenge, and you can join us by pledging, by posting a pledge photograph of yourself holding your hand up high in solidarity and tagging FBMHSR. But importantly, it's more than this. It is choosing to challenge. It is stepping up. It is calling out bias and inequality and really pushing for change, because we've still got a long way to go. We're getting there, but there's still a lot more to do. So thank you again, Nicole, very, very much. And thank you to everyone who's organised the meeting today. It's been really interesting. Thank you.